Hey guys, it's Rahul. So today I want to see if overclocking your GPU makes any difference. Before I get into the actual tests, I want you to know that the overclock on my GPU is not significant, as I have a superclocked card, which means they overclocked it from the factory to bring a higher clock speed. This means that when I overclocked it, I could only go about 125 MHz more on the core clock and 500 MHz more on the memory clock before it started to get unstable. I also want you to know that some of the games I tested, including Fallout 4, are very CPU-demanding titles, and I only have a dual-core processor. Because of this, bottlenecks occurred, and the difference just was not big. Thus, I'll be testing some other less demanding titles so they put less strain on my CPU and more on my GPU to see the real difference. Just for reference, my graphics card's core clock is 1085 MHz and the memory speed is 2500 MHz default. Using a tool called MSI Afterburner, we overclocked it to a core clock of 1210 MHz and a memory speed of 3000 MHz. I also want to point out that I won't be showing maximum frame rates since we're only focusing on the minimum and average ones. Anyway, that's enough rambling, so let's get straight into the benchmarks. Fallout 4 on PC looks absolutely amazing, even on lowest settings, which meant that a better GPU would help a lot. But when I came time to see the results of my overclock, I was a bit disappointed. At the stock clock speeds, I managed to pull a minimum of 10 FPS and a fairly impressive average of 47 FPS. When it came time to overclock, though, I also overestimated. At the minimum, we brought a decent increase of about 17 FPS, bringing it to 17 FPS minimum, but when it came to the average, the overclock only pushed an extra 3 FPS. Keep in mind that this was at the minimum settings, but there was also very noticeable stuttering. Moving on to a less CPU-intensive title, I also tested Tomb Raider 2013. In hopes to see how better the game ran after the overclock, I set the game to maximum possible graphics settings, including TressFX, which brought my PC to its knees. At minimum, we saw a terrible 6 FPS, but an average of about double that at 12.6 FPS. After overclocking, we managed to get the same minimum and, just like Fallout 4, an increase of only about 3 FPS on the average at 15.9 FPS. However, despite this low average, there were a lot of times where the game jumped to over 40 FPS during gameplay in places that weren't so graphics intensive. Even after testing Tomb Raider at max graphics though, things weren't looking as great as I expected. Pissing off the cops and sleeping dogs at max graphics brought a minimum of 6 FPS and a very slow 10 FPS average when not overclocked. After overclocking again, we saw almost no difference. Both frame rates only went up by 2 FPS, a minimum of 8 FPS and an average of about 12 FPS. Crysis 2 is finally where I started to see a noticeable difference. I set the graphics to hardcore, the maximum you can put it to, and when not overclocked, we saw a minimum of 18 FPS and an average of about 35.6 FPS. After tuning my card up, we saw an impressive 29 FPS minimum and a damn good average of about 44.8 FPS. That was an increase of about 11 FPS on the minimum and a 9.2 FPS increase on the average. Alright, enough gaming. For our last test to see if overclocking your GPU helps your games run better, let's get into some real 3D rendering benchmarks. During this test, it was hard to watch as my PC was being tortured. I started the Unity in Heaven benchmark and set it to the maximum possible graphics settings. Again, it wasn't much. Before overclocking, we got a 9.2 FPS minimum and a 15.8 FPS average. After overclocking, we saw a 10.3 FPS minimum and a decent 18 FPS average. However, despite the average being only 2.2 FPS higher, the jump from 15.8 to 18 is definitely noticeable. In conclusion, to answer our question, does overclocking your GPU make a difference? It depends. My card was factory overclocked, which meant that my overclock was not as big as it could be, if my card came untouched. If you want to overclock your GPU to get more juice out of it, make sure to get a non-superclocked or superclocked model. However, if you don't want to void your warranty, go ahead and get that superclocked card. Like everything else, GPUs have pros and cons and have their specific area of specialty. So next time you go out and buy a graphics card, make sure you get the right one. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and subscribe for more tech videos.